Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. This is our slow crawl through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book and author by author, period by period. The period that we've been dealing with the most lately is the ancient world, ancient Greece, the ancient Hebrews, ancient Rome, and all week long we've been doing ancient Rome. Yesterday we did the letters of Pliny the Younger, which I recommended to you in their Penguin Classic because they're so chatty and multifaceted that they're a great place to start. They're a great place for somebody who thinks that Roman literature is intimidating to dig right in and see the human side of Roman literature. And today we're dealing with a friend of Pliny the Younger, who's the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to dig right in, because he is fierce and can be fiercely intimidating. And this is Tacitus, who was born in the mid-50s. And so, if you do the math, I came to adulthood and into a career as an orator and politician at just the worst possible time, at the long period of the tyranny of Domitian, who was a very petty and paranoid tyrant, who was fond of calling himself a very stable genius, and who noted when people were being silent. And he noted when he wasn't getting praise. So he was a dangerous person if you were in the public eye at all, and even if you weren't, he had an exhaustive mental list of enemies. It was a dangerous time to be in the public eye, and that Tacitus was in the public eye the whole time. He wrote a number of books, but it seems to me that most of the writing that he did took place after Domitian died. So he, for instance, he reached the pinnacle of Roman society, Roman political society. He became a consul during the reign of Nerva, and Nerva's reign didn't last very long. And when it was over, you had Trajan, and Trajan was he was not a Roman, first of all. He was from Spain, and he was an enlightened ruler to pretty much the same extent as, for instance, Elizabeth I. Enlightened in this case being, I don't have a private enemies list. I don't care what you do with your private life. I don't care what you do with your public life, as long as you're not fomenting treason. You can write anything you want, very much including something critical of me or mine, as long as it's not scandalous. As long as you're not muckraking just to as it were, as we would say today, make a buck. So if you write a sex lampoon about my wife, the Empress, well, then I'll give you 2 days to evacuate the city and never come back. I might even have you strangled. But other than that, you can write histories all you like, and your interpretations can run against me as well as for me. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect my power at all. As long as you don't attack the living root of the state, you can do whatever you want. Very different atmosphere. Not, as that description will clearly underline for you, not what Americans, for instance, or most people in the modern world in 2020 would consider actual freedom. It's rather the sort of nod and wink disposition of a benevolent autocrat. There are those who are veteran news watchers in 2020 who say that pretty much the entire world is headed in that direction again. And that some people even saying it's a natural progression. One way or another, it was a totally different world, and it much suited Tacitus. It much suited him, and he said that many times. He was forthright about how nice it was to be able to think what you want and write what you please. But Tacitus was also writing during the reign of Domitian, and we have. He wrote some monographs. He wrote a monograph about the Germans in the Roman world, the Germans out on the frontier, that is still mined heavily by the alt-right today. He wrote a monograph about his father-in-law, very public figure that is fairly interesting, and in my opinion, one of the first examples of an actual biography, in the sense that we would understand the term. But he also wrote sweeping narrative histories. He wrote the histories, and he wrote the annals, and they are not complete. They come down to us with huge chunks missing, and they also come down to us in the very familiar manifestation of the pitiless ratio that we've been talking about all year long, in one or two manuscript copies that are late. So we we're not 100% sure what Tacitus wrote and how he wrote it, because this is not a simple author. His prose is fiercely spiky and fiercely complex. So it wouldn't take more than one or two scribal errors in some Benedictine cesspit for us to be dealing with a Tacitus that Tacitus himself would not recognize. That he'd look at it and say, "Well, some of this sounds like me, but there are mistakes everywhere here." That's horrifying to think about. But until a new manuscript turns up, there's no point. There's no point in agonizing over it. And I don't want to stress too much some of the stuff that Tacitus does in his books, in the Annals, for instance, this Penguin Classic here, which is translated by Michael Grant. Yes, translated by Michael Grant. The portrait that's painted of Tiberius Caesar is horrifying. Just a dim-witted, cloying monster of a tyrant, constantly complaining about how people don't treat him fairly, as he's doing one after another in Normandy. And there's a much longer video to be done on the fact that Tiberius is mostly Domitian. And that was Tacitus' way of joining the resistance. But there's a video for another time, and it's also not that important because it's not that pervasive. There's most of what you get in the Annals of Rome is brilliant character study and brilliant prose in a way that we have not seen yet, in a way that I would argue the world had not seen yet. Tacitus took a leaf from Seneca's book and changed his prose style. So this is sweeping narrative Roman history, but it doesn't read at all like Livy. Not at all. In fact, it reads as a very conscious counterpoint to Livy. Livy and Cicero have, as we've mentioned on this channel, they have these long, rolling, absolutely gorgeous periods in Latin that cannot be brought into English, and that when you read them in Latin, cast a spell that literally shimmers in the same sentence. Your understanding of the same sentence is shimmering until you get all the words in place, and then you get a new insight when it's all over. Tacitus doesn't do anything like that. There's no doubt that he was capable of it. He just isn't interested in writing history that way. His history instead is every bit as complex, but very much more driving, sharper, more staccato. I won't say concise because that's not exactly the right word. It's difficult to use. It's difficult even to think of the right adjective when comparing Tacitus's Latin to any English translation. Michael Grant's translation is very much Michael Grant. It sounds like him if you ever had the occasion to hear him talk, or maybe there are videos of him talking on YouTube. It sounds like him, and there's no reason why it shouldn't. It's just translators for hundreds of years have been saying that of all the Romans, even including Cicero and Livy, Tacitus is the one who's not translatable. And yet, of all the Romans that you could pull, all the Roman historians that you could pull off the shelf in a Penguin Classic tour and read, having no experience with them at all and no predilection one way or another, there's no Roman historian who will read more like the present day than Tacitus does, even no matter what kind of translation that you're doing. Michael Grant's translation is fairly good, but his translation didn't exist during the American Revolution or the Enlightenment, and those authors, the authors of that period, the thinkers and theoreticians of that period, they knew all of their ancient authors quite well, but none of them liked Tacitus. They worshipped him, absolutely worshipped him. They felt the same thing. So the Michael Grant's translation is in one sense irrelevant. Tacitus tends to have that effect. He feels that way. He reads that way when you're reading him. It reads like you're reading someone from our own era who was picked up and dropped back in ancient Rome. Not just in terms of preoccupations, but also just the way he writes, the way he sounds. I think that if I remember correctly, it comes through in Michael Grant's translation. So let me read you. Let me read you just a bit here, and you see what, if you can see what I mean. I am aware that much of what I have described and shall describe may seem unimportant and trivial, but my chronicle is quite a different matter from histories of early Rome. Their subjects were great wars, cities stormed, kings routed or captured, or, if home affairs were their choice, they could turn freely to conflicts of consuls with tribunes, to land and corn laws, feuds of conservatives and commons. Mine, on the other hand, is a circumscribed, inglorious field. Peace was scarcely broken, if at all. Rome was plunged in gloom, the ruler uninterested in expanding the empire. Yet even apparently insignificant events such as these are worth examination, for they often cause major historical developments. This is so whether the country or city is a democracy, an oligarchy, or an autocracy. For it is always one or the other. A mixture of the three is easier to applaud than to achieve, and besides, even when achieved, it cannot last long. When there was democracy, it was necessary to understand the character of the masses and how to control them. When the Senate was in power, those who best knew its mind, the mind of the oligarchs, were considered the wisest experts on contemporary events. Similarly, now that Rome has virtually been transformed into an autocracy, the investigation and record of these details concerning the autocrat may prove useful. Indeed, it is from such studies, from the experience of others, that most men learn to distinguish right from wrong, advantage from disadvantage. Few can tell them apart instinctively. So these accounts have their uses, but they are distasteful. What interests and stimulates readers is a geographical description, the changing fortune of a battle, the glorious death of a commander. My themes, on the other hand, concern cruel orders, unremitting accusations, treacherous friendships, innocent men ruined, a conspicuously monotonous glut of downfalls and their monotonous causes. Besides, whereas the ancient historians have few critics, nobody minds if he overpraises the Carthaginians or the Roman army. The men punished or disgraced under Tiberius have numerous descendants living today. And even when the families are extinct, some will think, if their own habits are similar, that the mention of another's crimes is directed against them. Even glory and merit make enemies by showing their opposites in too sharp and critical relief. Now, I think Michael Grant does a fine job, but that translation could be a lot worse, and you could still see the point I'm making. That is like nothing that we have read or heard about so far. And I'm here to tell you it's like nothing else that we have in the ancient world. And as sharp and aphoristic as Michael Grant can put that, it's much better in the original. The original has fired politicians and rhetoricians for centuries. So I wish that we had all of Tacitus. When the question comes up, what works from the ancient world that are missing would you most like to have? Tacitus, of course, comes to mind. Tacitus and Livy come to mind. But even the stuff that we have, when it comes time to recommend, I do, of course, recommend Tacitus. I can't help but recommend Tacitus. He's fantastic. But I would recommend a large amount of preparatory reading first on Wikipedia or wherever to get a sense for the world that he's describing. Maybe read a couple of modern histories. Michael Grant's own book, The 12 Caesars, is a perfect place to start. And then come back to the original and see what Tacitus does with it. But that is your Penguin Classic for today. It's ancient Rome. it's ancient Rome, and maybe we've mined ancient Rome a bit much this week. I have an old friend who's been watching these Penguin videos, and he emailed me yesterday and said, "Well, do they know that if you don't make a conscious effort to stop, you'll just talk about ancient Rome for the rest of the time, and that there are plenty of other ancient authors. So maybe we'll do some non-Romans next. So these next few videos, we shall see. We have a lot more penguins to go through. So that's your Penguin Classic for today. The Penguin Classic, Tacitus. I have Tacitus in Latin. As this video has probably made clear, I have a limited amount of patience reading him in even the best English translations. Because there's such a differentiation between them and what he actually wrote. I have the Annals of Imperial Rome in a Penguin Classic mass market. I don't have the histories. As far as I know, I don't have the Agricola or Germania. And I don't have anything in a trade paperback. If I saw those things, I would certainly get them, but I consult Tacitus in Michael Grant's English so seldom that I haven't thought necessary to repair the breach. so that is your Penguin Classic for today. It's Tacitus, an old friend, but not a warm friend. An old friend, but not human the way Pliny is. and certainly not immediate, not in the same room, the way Livy or Horace are. So, a different kind of thing, an austere and brilliant figure. Well worth your time if you haven't read him. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.